The land itself was a test, a crucible fired by a sun that knew no mercy. In this western expanse, circa 1875, the sky was not a gentle blue, but a hard, blinding sheet of silver-white heat that baked the earth until it cracked like old pottery. The dust was not brown or gray, but a deep, angry red that rose in ghostly plumes with every gust of wind, every hoofbeat, staining everything it touched, the hides of cattle, the canvas of wagons, the very lungs of the men and women who dared to call this place home. It was a land of sharp edges and stark contrasts, the jagged silhouette of distant mesas against the infinite horizon, the vibrant burst of a cactus flower blooming defiantly from a thorny stalk. Daylight was a battle against heat and thirst. Night was a truce with a different kind of adversary. When the sun finally bled away, leaving streaks of purple and orange across the vast emptiness, the air cooled. But the silence was never complete. It was a living silence, punctuated by the high, lonesome yip of a coyote pack on the hunt, the rustle of unseen things in the sagebrush, the mournful cry of an owl that sounded like a lost soul. Civilization was a rumor whispered between lonely outposts, scattered miles apart like forgotten beads on a broken string. A sheriff's station was often little more than a shack with a barred window, a trading post, a dusty collection of barrels and promises. To travel between them was an act of faith, a gamble against the elements and the desperate men who roamed the spaces in between. Into this unforgiving world rode a solitary figure. She was a woman, though the grit and determination in the set of her jaw belonged to someone who had lived more than her years suggested. Her name was Eliza, and she sat astride her dark bay gelding with an ease that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. The red dust coated her denim trousers and the worn leather of her boots, but she seemed oblivious to it, her gaze fixed on the familiar, brutal shape of the mountains ahead. She was not passing through. She was returning. The familiar sting of the wind on her cheeks, the scent of dry earth and sun-baked pine, pulled a memory from the depths of her soul, as sharp and clear as the day it was lived. 10 years ago. She had not been a woman then, but a specter of a girl, barely 17, with bones sharp beneath a tattered dress and eyes wide with the terror of the hunted. She had been running, not from the law, but from the swifter, crueler judgment of gossip and accusation. In the town she'd fled, a lie had been spun around her name, a venomous tale that branded her as a woman of ill repute, a fallen creature to be shunned and cast out. The accusation was a phantom she couldn't fight, chasing her from one settlement to the next. Hunger had become a gnawing beast in her belly. Fear was her only companion. She'd finally collapsed, exhausted and hopeless, at the edge of a small, isolated ranch, a place that seemed as weary and withdrawn as she felt. She had hidden in the barn, a structure that smelled of hay, old leather, and animal warmth, ready to bolt at the first sign of discovery. And then he had found her. He was a mountain of a man, with a grizzled beard that obscured the lines of his mouth and eyes that held the deep, quiet emptiness of the plains. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply stood in the barn doorway, a silhouette against the fading light, and looked at her. He saw the grime, the torn dress, the feral desperation in her eyes. He saw a creature brought low by the world. He disappeared without a word and returned a few minutes later. He set a tin plate on a hay bale. On it, a hunk of stale bread and some cold, leftover beans. Beside it, a cup of water from the well. He said nothing, asked no questions, and then he walked back to his house, leaving the barn door slightly ajar. For 3 weeks, that barn was her sanctuary. Every evening, he would leave a plate of food, never warm, never fresh, but always there. He never spoke to her, and she, in her shame and fear, never dared to speak to him. She learned his name was Samuel, whispered by a passing peddler who referred to him as the widower at the Broken Horn Ranch. She learned he had lost his wife and child years ago, a tragedy that had carved the silence into his face. He kept his distance, a solitary island of grief, but he had never not once, told her to leave. He had given her a space to breathe when the rest of the world was trying to suffocate her. One morning, she awoke to find the world outside quiet. The whispers that had chased her seemed to have faded. With a strength born of 3 weeks of meager but reliable food, she had slipped away before dawn, leaving nothing behind but a small, smooth stone placed on the empty tin plate, the only thing of value she had, a silent token of a debt she knew she could never truly repay. Now, a decade later, Eliza was no longer that frightened girl. The world had tried to break her, but it had forged her into something stronger. She had worked, saved, and learned to read people as well as she could read a trail. The gratitude she felt for the silent rancher had been a quiet, steady flame in her heart, a promise to herself that one day she would return. As she crested the final rise, the Broken Horn Ranch came into view, and her heart clenched. The memory was of a place that was worn but functional, lonely but alive. What lay before her now was a ghost. The main house sagged, its porch tilted like a broken jaw. The fences were splintered, sections missing entirely, leaving the barren fields open to the wild. The barn, her former sanctuary, had a gaping hole in its roof, dark and ugly against the sky. The place didn't look lonely, it looked defeated. Dismounting, she tied her horse to a withered fence post and walked toward the house, her boots sinking into the neglected earth. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay and failure. She found him sitting on the broken porch steps, staring at nothing. If he had been a mountain of a man before, he was now a collapsed hill. The years had not been kind. His hair and beard were almost entirely white, and a tangled, unkempt mess. He was thinner, the powerful shoulders slumped in defeat. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, resting stiffly in front of him, a crude, handmade crutch lying on the step beside him. But it was his eyes that struck her the most. The emptiness she remembered was gone, replaced by a dull, hollowed-out despair. He was a man who had lost his final battle and was simply waiting for the end. He looked up as her shadow fell over him, his eyes squinting. There was no flicker of recognition, only the weary indifference of a man who expected nothing good from the world. "Mr. Samuel?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He grunted, a sound more animal than human. "What do you want? There's nothing here for you. Nothing for anyone." Eliza's heart ached. This was the man who had saved her, now so lost he couldn't even save himself. She took a slow breath, the red dust filling her lungs. She had come back to repay a debt, but she saw now that it would require more than money or words. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I can mend fences, tend a garden, cook. I'm a hard worker. I don't ask for much. A place to sleep, a little food." He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Look around you. Woman, what is there to work on? The crops are dead. The cattle are long gone. This place is a graveyard." She didn't flinch. Her gaze met his, holding it. "You gave me shelter once," she said quietly. "In your barn. A long time ago, you gave me food when I had nothing. You never asked my name, and you never told me to leave." A flicker of something shifted in the depths of his haunted eyes, a confused, distant memory. He stared at her face, at the lines of experience that had replaced the soft fear of youth. He didn't seem to fully place her, but he remembered the act. He remembered the girl. Eliza knelt down, not in supplication, but so they were at eye level. Her demeanor was calm, her presence a quiet anchor in the sea of his despair. "I've come to work off my debt," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me stay. I'll help. I'll work in silence, just like before." He looked from her determined face to the ruins of his ranch, the physical proof of his broken spirit. He looked at his shattered leg, at the vast, empty sky. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the broken slats of the porch. He was too tired to argue, too broken to hope, but perhaps in some forgotten corner of his soul, too human to refuse the first echo of kindness he had been shown in a very long time. He gave a slow, heavy nod, a barely perceptible motion, and then he turned his face away, staring once more into the desolate landscape that had claimed his life. The silent agreement was made. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the broken land. Eliza rose before dawn, the air still carrying the deep, brittle chill of the high desert night. Her first task was always the garden, a dusty, neglected patch of earth behind the house. The soil was stubborn and dry, more red rock than loam. She spent hours on her knees, her hands raw from pulling up withered weeds and turning the compacted ground with a rusty spade she'd found in the barn. She coaxed life from it with a fierce tenderness, using the precious, sparingly drawn water from the well to nurse a few hardy rows of beans and squash back from the brink of death. From the garden, she would move to the barn. The great hole in the roof let in a stark pillar of light that illuminated dancing dust motes and the decay within. She mucked out stalls that hadn't been cleaned in years, the work physically draining but honest. She mended what she could, using scavenged planks and old nails to patch the splintered walls, her hammer blows echoing in the vast silence. Her final duty of the morning was to Samuel. She would clean the festering wound on his leg, a poorly healed break that had become a chronic source of pain. She would boil rags and apply a poultice of herbs she recognized from a childhood spent closer to nature. He endured her touch with a stoic, unnerving stillness, never wincing, never speaking, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the dilapidated room. The land itself was a constant, brooding presence. The nights grew colder, a penetrating cold that seeped through the cracks in the walls and made sleep a shivering ordeal. On nights when the moon was full and white, the howling of the coyotes would begin, a chorus of wild, predatory loneliness that seemed to mock the small, fragile island of their existence. Water was a constant anxiety. The well was low, and every bucket she drew felt like a theft from the future. The threat of raiders was a silent fear that hung in the air. Twice, she saw distant riders, dark figures moving along the ridgeline, and she and Samuel would instinctively remain indoors, silent and unseen, until they passed. It was a life pared down to its most essential elements: work, endurance, and the quiet, shared understanding of their vulnerability. Samuel remained a ghost in his own home. He would sit for hours on the porch, his useless leg propped before him, his gaze as vacant as the landscape. But Eliza began to notice a change. His silence was no longer one of complete apathy. Sometimes, as she worked in the garden, she would feel his eyes on her. When she looked up, he would quickly turn away. But she had seen it, a flicker of awareness, of observation. He watched her mend the fence, his brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her draw water, his jaw tight. He was a spectator to the resurrection of his own life, and a quiet, profound battle seemed to be taking place behind his stony facade. He was a man locked in a prison of his own grief, and she was a stranger rattling the key in the lock, and he did not yet know if he wanted the door to open. Then the sky turned on them. For a week, clouds had been gathering in the west, a bruised purple mass that promised but never delivered rain. One evening, the promise was kept with a vengeance. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a physical force, shaking the small house to its foundations. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof and turned the dusty yard into a roiling sea of red mud. Eliza and Samuel were inside, the meager light from a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the very air they breathed, followed by a sound of splintering wood and a groaning collapse from the main room. They rushed in to see a section of the roof had given way. Rain and wind poured through a new, jagged hole, soaking the floorboards and the few remaining pieces of furniture. For a moment, they stood frozen, the chaos of the storm invading their sanctuary. Then, instinct took over. "The canvas!" Eliza shouted over the roar of the wind, pointing to a heavy, oiled tarpaulin she had seen in the barn. It was the first time she had raised her voice, the first time she had given him an order. Something in her urgency broke through his lethargy. He grabbed his crutch and, with a grimace of pain, pushed himself to his feet. They fought the storm together all through the night. It was a desperate, primal struggle. They dragged the heavy canvas from the barn, the wind tearing at it like a living beast. Inside, they wrestled it into place, climbing on a rickety table to try and cover the hole. The rain lashed down on them, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking them to the bone. Their hands brushed, their shoulders bumped. In the frantic effort to secure a rope, he stumbled, and she grabbed his arm to steady him, her fingers sinking into the hard muscle beneath his wet shirt. It was the first time they had truly touched, not as patient and caregiver, but as two people locked in a shared struggle against a common foe. His skin was warm, solid, real. In that moment, he was not a ghost or a memory, but a man of flesh and blood beside her. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, the storm had passed, leaving a world washed clean and utterly devastated. They had managed to secure the canvas, a temporary and ugly patch, but it held. They collapsed at the kitchen table, exhausted, shivering, and covered in mud. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the shared memory of the night's battle. It was in the days that followed, as they cleaned up the mess, that she found it. Tucked away in the back of a water-damaged chest was a small tin box, believing it to be empty. She opened it to let it dry. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a daguerreotype of a smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm around a small boy with a serious expression, holding a wooden horse. There was also a lock of fine, blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a single, child-sized leather shoe, its toe scuffed from play. The objects radiated a love so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. Later that evening, as she was preparing a simple stew, Samuel spoke, his voice a low, rough rasp from disuse. "That was Mary," he said, nodding toward the chest she had left open. "And our boy, Thomas." Eliza froze, her hand still holding a ladle. She said nothing, waiting, knowing this was a sacred and fragile moment. "It was raiders," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. 5 years ago, they came for the cattle. I was out on the range. When I came back, the house was burning." He paused, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "They were inside, the smoke." His voice broke, and he couldn't finish. He didn't need to. The image of fire and smoke and unimaginable loss filled the small kitchen, more potent than any words. Now she understood. She understood the silence, the vacant eyes, the refusal to hope. His heart hadn't just been broken, it had been burned to ash, and he had been living in the ruins ever since. He didn't trust the world because the world had taken everything from him. He didn't trust people because people had been the instrument of his pain. His kindness to her, 10 years ago, had been the last ember of a dying fire, and then he had let it go out. From that day on, Eliza's mission changed. It was no longer about repaying a debt of shelter. It was about resurrecting a man. She began to cook for him in earnest. No longer just beans and bread, but hot stews that filled the house with the scent of simmering herbs, of life. She baked bread, and the smell of it was a defiance against the scent of decay. She became his relentless, gentle teacher in the art of walking. She insisted he use the crutch not just to hobble from his bed to his chair, but to walk outside, to feel the sun on his face. At first, he resisted, his pride and his pain a formidable wall, but she was patient. "One step, Samuel," she would say, her voice calm and firm. "Just one more." And he, with a groan of effort that was half physical, half spiritual, would take that step. In the evenings, by the light of the lantern, she began to read to him. She had found a worn Bible and an old almanac. Her own reading was slow and careful, but her voice was clear. She read him passages of resilience and faith, of seasons and stars, of a world that continued to turn despite the deepest of personal sorrows. At first, he would just stare into the fire, seemingly deaf to her words. But then, she noticed his eyes would follow the lines on the page over her shoulder. He began to listen. He began to see, slowly, painfully, like the first green shoots pushing through the hard, red earth of her garden. Samuel was coming back to life. A flicker of interest would appear in his eyes when she spoke of the mended fence. A hint of a question would form on his lips when she described the progress of the squash vines. He was not healed. The wound in his soul was as deep and grievous as the one on his leg. But he was no longer a ghost. Eliza had come to save the man who had sheltered her, and in the process, she was forcing him to see that he was, against all odds, still alive. She was pulling him, step by agonizing step, back into the light. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other, marked by the slow crawl of the sun across the sky. When a rider appeared on the horizon, he was not a threat. He rode with an easy, confident lope, his horse moving with a familiar rhythm. As he drew closer, Eliza could see he was a young man, lean and weathered from the sun, with a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, revealing a mess of sun-streaked brown hair. There was a lightness about him, in the way he sat his saddle, in the relaxed line of his shoulders. He was the antithesis of the heavy, earthbound silence that defined the Broken Horn Ranch. He dismounted at the fence, his movements fluid and economical. Samuel, who had been sitting on the porch, stiffened. His hand went to the worn wood of his crutch. "Sam," the young man called out, his voice clear and friendly. "Sam, you old badger, is that really you?" A long, tense moment passed. Then, Samuel gave a gravelly response. "Luke," the young man. Luke broke into a wide grin and strode toward the porch, his spurs jingling softly. His smile faltered as he took in the full measure of his friend. He saw the crippled leg, the hollowed-out eyes, the ruin of the ranch behind him. "My God, Sam," he said, his voice losing its cheerful edge, replaced by a deep concern. "I heard you had some trouble, but I didn't reckon it was this bad." Samuel just grunted, his gaze fixed on some distant point. It was then that Luke's eyes fell on Eliza as she came to stand quietly in the doorway, wiping her dusty hands on an apron. He looked at her, and his brows drew together in a flicker of recognition. He scanned her face, her sensible dress, the strength in her posture. He remembered being here once, years ago, passing through. He remembered Sam mentioning a half-starved, ragged girl he'd let sleep in the barn for a spell. He had only caught a glimpse of her then, a frightened wraith flitting in the shadows. This was not that girl. This was a woman. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet competence. The gauntness of starvation had given way to the lean strength of hard work. Her features, once obscured by grime and misery, had settled into a kind of reserved grace. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted ladies in town saloons, but there was a deep, compelling comeliness to her, a story of survival and resilience in the clear depth of her gaze. Luke, a man who prided himself on reading people as well as he read a trail, was utterly captivated. "And you are?" he asked, his tone respectful, a hint of a playful smile returning to his lips. "Eliza," she said simply. "I work for Mr. Samuel." Luke's gaze shifted from her to the newly weeded garden, to the patched section of the barn wall, to the general sense that a slow, determined battle was being waged against the decay. "I see," he said, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked back at Samuel. "Looks like you found yourself some good help, old friend." Samuel's only reply was a tightening of his grip on his crutch. Luke's arrival was like a stone tossed into a still, deep pond. The ripples he created changed everything. He was a creature of words and laughter in a house of silence. He stayed on, claiming his horse needed a rest and that he had a duty to check on his old friend. He set about helping Eliza with the heavier chores, his youthful energy a stark contrast to Samuel's immobility. He rehung the main gate, his whistling a cheerful, alien sound in the quiet air. He helped Eliza repair the hole in the barn roof properly, and their easy camaraderie as they worked was a new and unsettling development. He began to court her, though he never would have used such a formal word. He did it with small gestures and relentless, gentle teasing. He would appear at her side in the garden, offering a water skin. "A flower as hard-working as you needs more water than these squash," he'd say with a wink. He would tell her stories of his time on the cattle drives, his voice animated, his eyes sparkling with humor, and he would watch, delighted, as the ghost of a smile would touch her lips. He drew her out, asking her questions about herself, not about her past, but about what she thought of the sky, or the taste of wild berries, or the sound of the wind. Eliza found herself caught in a disorienting tide of emotion. For 10 years, her life had been a straight, hard line of survival and duty. Her focus had been singular: repay Samuel. Her gratitude toward him was the bedrock of her existence. He was her anchor, the man who had shown her a sliver of mercy when the world had shown her none. But Luke was different. He saw her not as a debt to be paid or a project to be fixed, but as a woman. His attention was like the sun on her face after a long, cold winter. It was warm. It was life-giving, and it made her feel a fluttering in her chest she had long thought dead. She would catch herself smiling at one of his jokes and immediately feel a sharp pang of guilt, her eyes darting to Samuel, who was always watching. Samuel's jealousy was a quiet, suffocating thing. He never spoke a word against Luke. He never questioned his presence, but the air around him grew colder, heavier. When he saw Luke make Eliza laugh, the little progress he had made would seem to vanish, the light in his eyes dimming, the wall of silence rebuilding itself, thicker than before. He would stare at them, his expression unreadable but radiating a possessive, wounded bitterness. He had been alone in his tomb for years, and now that a single candle had been lit, he could not bear the thought of a fresh wind blowing it out. The fragile peace of the ranch was replaced by a tense, unspoken triangle of gratitude, attraction, and resentment. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Luke found Eliza by the well, staring up at the sky as the first stars began to prick the deep indigo velvet of twilight. "A penny for what you're thinking," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "They're just thoughts," she answered, not looking at him. "Not worth a penny." "I doubt that," he said. He was quiet for a moment, his usual teasing manner gone, replaced by a gentle seriousness. "He's a good man, Eliza, Sam. One of the best I ever knew before. He saved my life," she whispered, as if the admission was a prayer. "I owe him everything." "You've paid him back," Luke said, his voice firm. "You've paid him back 10 times over. You've given him a reason to get out of that chair. You've brought this whole place back from the grave. A debt is one thing. A life sentence is another." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes wide and uncertain in the dim light. He held her gaze, his own full of a startling intensity and a deep, sincere kindness. "Come with me," he said, gesturing with his head toward a low hill that overlooked the ranch. "I want to show you something." Hesitantly, she followed him. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the chirping of crickets. At the top of the hill, the entire world seemed to open up. The sky was a magnificent, dizzying canopy of stars. A river of diamonds spilled across the blackness. The air was cool and clean. Down below, the ranch was a small, dark shape, the single point of light from the lantern in the window looking tiny and frail. They stood there for a long time, just looking. The immensity of the night sky had a way of putting earthly troubles into perspective. I used to think the stars were holes in the floor of heaven, Luke said, his voice a low murmur. Silly, I know. A kid's fancy. He turned to her, his profile outlined by the starlight. When I look at you, Eliza, I see someone who has spent her whole life just trying to keep her feet on the ground, trying not to fall. You've been running, or hiding, or working, always doing what you had to do to survive, always living for someone else. His words struck a chord so deep within her it was painful. He saw her. He saw past the quiet helper, past the grateful stray, and saw the core of her, the girl who had never had the luxury of a single choice. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. You deserve more than just survival. You deserve a life of your own choosing. The words hung in the vast, silent air between them. Asterisk, a life of your own choosing. It was a concept so foreign, so beautiful. It shattered the careful defenses she had built around her heart. It wasn't a proposal, or a promise, or a flirtation. It was a validation of her very soul. A single tear escaped her eye, then another, tracing silent paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders began to shake with the force of a decade of unshed grief, of unspoken loneliness, of a desperate, forbidden yearning for the very thing he had just named. She stood there, weeping silently under the endless stars, and she did not, could not, answer him. The promise of rain that had broken the drought was a fleeting, cruel memory. The sun returned with a vengeance, a white-hot hammer that beat down on the land day after relentless day. The creek dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the water level in the well dropped, each bucket drawn, feeling heavier, more precious than the last. The earth of the garden turned to red powder, and the squash vines withered on the stalk despite Eliza's tireless efforts. A palpable desperation began to settle over the Broken Horn Ranch, a thirst that was as much spiritual as it was physical. It was during this time that the outside world intruded, not with the friendly face of a man like Luke, but with the cold, calculating gaze of progress. A man named Mr. Davies from the Atlas Mining Corporation rode out to the ranch. He was dressed in a fine city suit that looked ridiculous and out of place, and he rode a polished saddle that had never known a day of hard work. He made an offer for the land, a generous one by any standard, explaining that the corporation had plans for the entire valley. Samuel, who had been speaking in sentences rather than grunts for weeks, reverted to his stony silence. He sat on the porch, his crippled leg a testament to his permanence, and simply shook his head. Davies was not deterred. "Mr. Samuel," he said, his voice smooth and patient as if explaining something to a child. "This land is failing. The water is gone. We are offering you a chance to walk away with a fortune, to live out your days in comfort." "This land is not for sale," Samuel stated, his voice a low rumble. "It holds my dead. It is not for sale." Davies returned twice more, his offers increasing, his smile thinning with each refusal. On his final visit, the smile was gone completely. "You are making a mistake," he said, the politeness in his tone now a brittle veneer over a core of steel. "The Atlas Corporation always gets what it wants." A week later, their answer came in the form of 3 hired men. They were rough-looking riders with mean eyes and guns worn low on their hips. They didn't come to the house. They rode straight to the newly mended section of the barn, and with axes and brute force, they began to tear it apart, undoing weeks of Eliza and Luke's hard work in a matter of minutes. Luke, who had been checking the fences, saw them and came riding in at a gallop. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled, leaping from his horse. The leader, a big man with a scar that split his left eyebrow, just grinned. "Delivering a message from Mr. Davies. Your friend here needs to learn to be a more reasonable businessman." Luke was brave, but he was 1 against 3. He threw the first punch, a clean, hard shot that sent one of the men staggering, but the other 2 were on him in an instant. Eliza watched in horror from the doorway as they beat him to the ground with fists and booted feet. They were methodical, brutal, and efficient. When Luke was a groaning, bleeding heap in the dirt, they stopped. The leader spat near his head. "Next time, we burn it," he said, loud enough for Eliza and the silent, watching Samuel to hear, "with everyone inside." Then they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a wrecked barn and a broken man. Eliza rushed to Luke's side, helping him limp into the house, as she cleaned the cuts on his face and wrapped his bruised ribs. A cold, hard fury solidified in her heart. This was the world she had run from, a world where powerful men used brutes to crush anyone who stood in their way. She had run from it once. She would not run again. That evening, ignoring the pained protests from Luke in the dark, thunderous silence from Samuel, she saddled her horse. "I'm going to town," she said. "You are not," Samuel commanded, his voice sharp. "You will stay here. This is not your fight." "They made it my fight when they hurt him," she retorted, her gaze unflinching. "They made it my fight when they threatened this home." She rode into the dusty settlement and went straight to the saloon. The place fell silent as she pushed through the batwing doors. She ignored the stairs and walked directly to the table where the three thugs were drinking. She stopped before the leader, the man with the scar. "My name is Eliza," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. "And you will leave the Broken Horn Ranch alone." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And why would we do that, little lady?" Eliza reached into a small pouch at her belt and placed something on the table. It was a heavy, silver pocket watch, its cover intricately engraved with the initials JTM. "Because 10 years ago, I was hiding in a hayloft near the Black Creek crossing," she said, her voice dropping. Yet every man in the room seemed to lean in to hear. "I saw you and your friends rob a stagecoach. I saw you shoot the driver, a man named Jeremiah T. Morgan. And after you took his money, you took this watch from his body. I saw you drop it as you rode off." The man's face went pale beneath his tan. The laughter died in his throat. "I have kept it all these years," Eliza continued, her voice like ice. "I also have a sworn statement written down, describing you, your horse, and every detail of that day. It is hidden where no one but the territorial marshal will find it if anything should happen to me, or to Samuel, or to Luke. You will leave the ranch alone. You will tell Mr. Davies his business here is finished, or so help me God. I will see you hang." She turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the silver watch gleaming on the table in a stunned, absolute silence. When she returned to the ranch, Samuel was waiting for her on the porch. The lantern light cast his face in harsh shadows, and his eyes were blazing with an emotion she had never seen in him before, pure, terrifying rage. "What have you done?" he roared, his voice cracking with the force of it. He struggled to his feet, grabbing his crutch. "You foolish, reckless girl! Do you have any idea what you've put yourself into?" "I protected us," she said, standing her ground. "You painted a target on your back," he shouted, taking a clumsy step toward her. "This isn't some game. Eliza, these are killers. I kept you safe in that barn all those years ago from whispers and lies. I cannot keep you safe from this. I will not watch them put you in the ground." His anger was born of a terror so profound it was shaking his entire body. It was the terror of a man who had already lost everything he loved to violence and could not bear to witness it again. "You will pack your things," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly, broken command. "You will take your horse, and you will leave this place before sunrise. You will not come back. I order you to go." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The man who had been her silent savior was now casting her out. She stared at him, her heart shattering. She saw not cruelty in his eyes, but a desperate, panicked fear. He was pushing her away to save her, and it was the cruelest kindness he could possibly have shown her. Tears streaming down her face, she turned without a word, packed her small bedroll, and rode away from the Broken Horn Ranch in the dead of night. the sound of his ragged, furious breathing echoing in her ears. She had nowhere else to go. She rode to Luke's small line cabin, a one-room shack he used when he was working cattle in the area. She found him sitting outside, a bottle of whiskey in his hand, his face a mask of pain in the moonlight. He looked up as she approached, and his expression softened with concern when he saw the tears on her face. He helped her down from her horse and led her inside. The cabin was small, Spartan, but clean. He poured her a measure of whiskey into a tin cup. "He threw you out," he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, taking a gulp of the fiery liquid. It burned its way down her throat, a welcome pain that distracted from the ache in her chest. She told him everything about the saloon, the watch, the murder she had witnessed, and Samuel's furious, terrified reaction. They shared the bottle, the whiskey loosening their tongues and their sorrows. They talked for hours, their voices low and intimate in the small, lamp-lit room. She spoke of her years as a ghost, always looking over her shoulder. He spoke of his own lonely life on the trail, of dreams he'd almost forgotten. In the shared vulnerability of the night, fueled by whiskey and a deep, aching need for comfort, the space between them shrank. He reached out and gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his thumb lingering on her skin. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken feelings. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tentative kiss that was full of all the words they hadn't said. It was a kiss of comfort, of admiration, of a deep and burgeoning affection. She kissed him back, a desperate, hungry response. For a moment, she allowed herself to drown in the sensation, in the feeling of being wanted, of being seen. His arms went around her, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more passionate. It was a raw, honest expression of two lonely souls finding a momentary solace in one another. But then the image of Samuel's face, contorted with fear and rage, flashed in her mind. Samuel, who had given her bread when she was starving. Samuel, who had given her a roof when she had none. Samuel, who had just thrown her out to save her life. With a choked sob, she pushed herself away from Luke, scrambling back. The spell was broken. "I can't," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and shame. "Luke, I can't." He looked at her, his own breathing ragged, his eyes full of hurt and confusion. "He saved me," she cried, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintered loyalties together. "Even now, he was trying to save me. I can't betray that, not even for a moment of happiness, not even for you." She curled up on the far side of the small room, her back to him, and wept, her heart a battlefield where gratitude and desire waged a war that had no winner. Luke sat in the silence, the taste of her on his lips and the cold, bitter reality of her words settling like a stone in his gut. Dawn broke, cold and gray. The morning after she had fled, Eliza did not sleep. She sat by the dying embers of Luke's fire until the sky began to lighten, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Duty was a magnet, its pull irresistible and absolute. With a quiet word of thanks to a sleeping Luke, she mounted her horse and rode back to the place she had been banished from. She returned not to a welcome, but to an oppressive, suffocating silence. Samuel was on the porch, looking as if he hadn't moved all night. He saw her approach, and his face was a mask of stone, betraying nothing. She dismounted, unsaddled her horse, and went to the well to draw water, her movements stiff and automatic. She resumed her chores as if she had never left, as if his furious, terrified words had been a dream. The days that followed were an exercise in agony. The air in the small house was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of anger, betrayal, and a desperate, clinging need. The three of them moved around each other like celestial bodies trapped in a miserable orbit. Luke was no longer a source of light and laughter. He was quiet, his eyes shadowed with a pain he tried to hide. He would look at Eliza, his gaze full of a tender, sorrowful question she could not answer. Samuel watched them both, his silence a tangible thing, a fourth presence in the room. He would sit for hours, his hands gripping his crutch, the muscles in his jaw tight. It was a silence born of jealousy, fear, and a profound, wounded pride. Eliza felt as though she were being torn in three. Every gentle word from Luke was a pleasure that felt like a betrayal. Every silent, brooding look from Samuel was a reminder of a debt that felt more like a chain. She worked relentlessly, from sunrise to sunset, hoping to exhaust her body so her mind would have no energy left to feel. The breaking point came a week after her return. Luke found her by the barn, mending a piece of tack. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "I'm leaving, Eliza," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "Riding east. There's nothing for me here." Her hands stilled. She couldn't look at him. "Luke, Don't," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to say anything. I understand. Or at least, I'm trying to. You've got a loyalty in you that's stronger than anything I've ever seen. I can't fight it, and it's killing me to watch it." He paused. "I just hope, one day, you'll be loyal to yourself." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this for you. Read it when you're alone. Maybe it'll make sense of things." He pressed it into her hand, his fingers briefly closing over hers, a touch that was both warm and final. "Be well, Eliza." She watched him ride away, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, indifferent horizon. Until he was gone, the letter felt like a hot coal in her hand. She tucked it away, unread, unable to face the finality of his words. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was absolute. There were only two of them now. Samuel ate slowly, his eyes on his plate. After a long time, he pushed his plate away and looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy. "You'll be leaving again then?" he asked, his voice a quiet rasp. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of weary resignation, of a man preparing himself for the final abandonment. The question held all his fear, his loneliness, and the unspoken acknowledgement that he had driven away the only other source of life that had entered their bleak world. "No, Samuel," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'm not leaving." A flicker of something, relief, confusion, perhaps even shame, passed through his eyes before the mask of stone settled back into place. The attack came 3 nights later. The moon was a pale, hazy sliver, offering little light. Eliza was jolted from a shallow sleep by the smell of smoke and the hellish, orange glow that was beginning to flicker through the window. The thugs had kept their promise. She burst out of her small room to find the porch and part of the main wall already engulfed in flames. "Samuel!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. She found him in the main room, a silhouette against the roaring fire. He wasn't trying to escape. He was standing, braced on his one good leg, the old shotgun he kept above the mantel in his hands. As the front door was kicked in, revealing the forms of 2 men, he fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and one of the men screamed and fell back, but the other one was on him in an instant, a heavy piece of timber in his hands. Eliza saw the first blow fall, saw Samuel stagger and go down. She didn't think. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and ran, screaming with a fury she didn't know she possessed. She brought the skillet down on the man's head with all her strength. He grunted and stumbled, turning to her with a look of stunned surprise, which gave Samuel the moment he needed, lying on the floor. He swung his heavy crutch like a club, catching the man squarely in the knees. The man howled and collapsed. "Go!" Samuel roared, his voice choked with smoke. "Get out of here! Eliza, run!" But she wouldn't leave him. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed. the heat scorching their skin, the smoke thick and blinding. She grabbed him under the arms, pulling him, dragging him toward the back of the house as the roof began to groan ominously above them. He was a dead weight, barely conscious, a bloody gash on his forehead. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, she managed to haul him out a back window and away from the inferno, just as the main roof collapsed with a deafening roar. She half carried, half dragged him into the darkness, away from the burning pyre that had been their home. She knew they couldn't stay on the plains. They were exposed, and Samuel was gravely injured. There was only one place to go, up into the mountains. For 2 days, she guided them higher, following old game trails, pushing deeper into the cold, silent wilderness. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever. She found a deserted hunter's cabin, a tiny, one-room hovel tucked into a pine-choked ravine, just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. The cabin was their freezing, desperate sanctuary. She got a small, smoky fire going in the stone hearth and laid Samuel on the single, rickety cot. The snow fell harder, a thick, silent curtain that cut them off from the rest of the world. For days, she nursed him. She melted snow for water. She made a thin broth from the few dried rations she had in her saddlebags. She cleaned and bandaged his head wound and the vicious burns on his arms, tearing strips from her own petticoat for bandages. He was lost in a fever dream, muttering names she didn't know, Mary, Thomas. She would wipe his brow with a cool, damp cloth, her touch gentle, her heart aching with a terror she refused to acknowledge. She was alone, trapped by a blizzard, with a man who was dying. On the 4th night, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time, though clouded with pain and confusion. He looked at her, then at the rough log walls of the cabin, the snow visible through the cracks.
"Eliza?"
he rasped, his voice weak.
"I'm here, Samuel,"
she said, leaning closer, her voice thick with relief.
"You're safe."
He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her face. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He traced the line of her cheek, his gaze holding hers. "You stayed," he whispered, a world of wonder and disbelief in those 2 words.
"I told you I wouldn't leave,"
she replied, her own voice shaking. In that moment, in the flickering firelight of the freezing cabin, with the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, the last of their barriers crumbled. He was not the stoic rancher. She was not the indebted servant. They were just 2 people, stripped of everything, clinging to each other for warmth, for life itself. A profound and overwhelming tenderness washed over her. It was a feeling deeper than gratitude, more complex than desire. He tugged her hand gently, and she leaned down. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a desperate, soul-deep need. It tasted of smoke and fever and sorrow. It was a kiss of utter vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured together. She kissed him back, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek and mingling with the salt on their lips. It was a kiss that was both a surrender and a discovery, a moment of pure, unvarnished truth in the heart of the storm. They were simply 2 souls finding a fragile anchor in one another. She pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against his, their breath mingling in the cold air. The firelight played across his face, and in his eyes, she saw not emptiness, but a reflection of her own complicated heart. She had come back to save him, but in saving him, she had bound herself to his fate, to his land, to his pain, and Luke, with his promise of a life of her own choosing, seemed a ghost from another world. She closed her eyes, the truth of her impossible position settling over her with the weight of the snow outside. She whispered the words into the small, warm space between their lips, a confession to him and to herself.
"I can't leave, but I can't stay."
The blizzard lasted for 2 more days, cocooning them in a world of white silence. When the storm finally broke, the world outside the small cabin was pristine and dazzling, the sun on the fresh snow a near blinding brilliance. Inside, the air had also cleared. Samuel woke from a long, natural sleep, his fever gone, his mind sharp and lucid for the first time since the fire. He sat up slowly, his movements stiff with pain, and looked at Eliza as she stirred the last of their broth over the fire. The memory of the previous night, the kiss, her whispered confession, hung in the quiet space between them, not as something shameful, but as a truth that had finally been spoken.
Eliza,
he said, his voice quiet but steady. She turned to him, her expression guarded.
Thank you,
he said, the words simple but imbued with a profound weight. You saved my life. Again, he looked down at his own hands, calloused and burned. I have to say, I'm sorry for what I did, for what I've been doing since you came back. She frowned, not understanding.
You have nothing to be sorry for.
Yes, I do, he insisted, his gaze rising to meet hers, clear and full of a painful self-awareness. I was a drowning man, Eliza, and when you appeared, I grabbed onto you. I used your goodness, your sense of duty, as an anchor. I let you pull me to shore, but I never intended to set foot on the land. I was content to just sit in the wreckage, as long as I wasn't alone in it. It was selfish. It was wrong. I put a weight on you that was never yours to carry. His apology was the one thing she had never expected. His words, a confession of his own weakness and a validation of her strength, undid her completely. All the years of holding herself together, of being the strong one, of burying her own pain beneath layers of duty and work, it all came apart. A choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. The carefully constructed dam of her emotions broke, and a decade of grief poured out. She wept, her body shaking with the force of it. She cried for the girl she had been, hunted and afraid. She cried for the woman she had become, so defined by a debt she felt she could never repay. You don't understand, she gasped through her tears, the words tumbling out in a raw, ragged torrent. You don't know what it was like. For 10 years, I've been a shadow. Every time someone looked at me too long, I would flinch. Every time a man was kind, I thought it was a trick. The lie they told about me, it followed me everywhere. It was like a stench I couldn't wash off. People would look at me and see something dirty, something unclean. I started to believe it myself. I believed I didn't deserve a kind word, or a safe place to sleep, or a moment of happiness. I believed I was unworthy of anyone. Her confession hung in the cold air, a testament to a wound far deeper than any fire could inflict. Samuel listened, his own heart aching with a pain that mirrored hers. When she finally fell silent, her weeping subsiding into shuddering breaths, he reached for her. He was clumsy with his injured body, but he pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly against his chest. He was no longer the distant, broken man from the ranch. He was simply a man holding a woman who was in immense pain. He held her until the shudders ceased, his hand stroking her hair. He felt the immense, fragile strength of her, and a fierce, protective resolve ignited within him, burning away the last vestiges of his own self-pity. When Mary and Thomas died, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper against her hair. The world went dark. I've been walking in that darkness for 5 years. Eliza, my eyes have been open, but I have seen nothing. I was just waiting for the end, waiting to finally close them for good. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own gaze burning with a new, startling intensity. You are the first thing I have truly seen in all that time. You are not a shadow. You are not something unclean. You are the strongest, most honorable person I have ever known. He took a deep, shuddering breath and made a vow, as much to himself as to her. If you are the last light I can still see, then I will not close my eyes again. The journey back down the mountain was slow and arduous. But they were no longer two separate people struggling for survival. They were a unit, bound by a new, unspoken understanding. They found the Broken Horn Ranch a smoldering, blackened ruin. The house was gone, reduced to a chimney stack and a pile of charred timbers. The barn was a skeleton. It was a scene of total devastation, the physical manifestation of a life that had been burned to the ground. As they stood there, surveying the wreckage, a lone rider appeared, coming not from the east, but from the west. It was Luke. He rode up, his face grim, and dismounted. He had heard about the fire in a town 2 days away, and had ridden back without a second thought. "Sam," he said, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and relief. I thought you were—" "She got me out," Samuel said, his hand resting briefly on Eliza's shoulder. Luke's gaze went to Eliza, and in his eyes she saw his heartache, his concern, and a quiet, sad understanding that something fundamental had shifted between the three of them. There was no room for jealousy in the face of such total destruction, only a shared purpose. And so they began to rebuild. The work was backbreaking, but it was a healing balm. With Luke's strength, Eliza's resilience, and Samuel's renewed will, a new structure began to rise from the ashes. They salvaged what they could and felled new timber from the hills. They worked from dawn until dusk, their shared labor a silent conversation of forgiveness and solidarity. One evening, as the frame of a new, smaller house stood stark against the sunset, Samuel presented Eliza with a piece of paper drawn up by a lawyer in the next county. It was a deed. He was making her a full, legal partner, co-owner of the Broken Horn Ranch. "No," she said, shaking her head. "The debt is paid. I don't need this." "This is not about a debt," Samuel said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "This is about a home. The Atlas Corporation will be back. Their threats won't stop with a burned-out ranch. When they come, they will face both of us. This is your land as much as it is mine. You have bled for it. Your name belongs on it." Luke stood by the fire, a silent witness to the exchange. He watched Eliza's face, saw the conflict, the hesitation, and then the slow dawn of acceptance. With a trembling hand, she took the pen and signed her name next to Samuel's. In that moment, she ceased to be a drifter, a shadow. She had a home. She had a name on a piece of land. The final battle was not fought with fire or fists, but with the law. A week later, the three of them rode into the county seat, a proper town with a courthouse and a unit. Marshal, they walked into his office, the air thick with the smell of cigar smoke and justice. Eliza, flanked by the two men, placed the engraved silver pocket watch on the marshal's desk. With a clear, steady voice, she told her story. Not the story of a fallen woman, but of a witness to a murder. She gave her sworn testimony, her memory of the event 10 years prior as sharp and clear as glass. The watch was the proof, the undeniable link to the killer. The marshal listened, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When she mentioned that the man, Jed, was now working as an enforcer for the Atlas Mining Corporation, he brought his fist down on his desk. The wheels of justice, once started, moved with surprising speed. Jed and his men were arrested. An investigation was launched into the corporation's methods. The deed to the Broken Horn Ranch, now bearing two names, was filed and recognized as ironclad, standing on the courthouse steps, with the legal documents in her hand. Eliza felt the last of the shadows that had clung to her for a decade finally burn away in the bright, unforgiving light of the sun. She had not only saved the rancher, she had saved herself. Her name was clean. Her future, for the first time in her life, was her own. Life at the rebuilt ranch settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The days were still long and filled with hard work, but the desperate, frantic energy was gone, replaced by the steady, hopeful labor of creation. The sharp edges of the unspoken tension between the three of them had been worn smooth by shared struggle and a common purpose. Yet, a delicate, Unaddressed sorrow lingered in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the heart that had to be broken for their fragile peace to be built. One bright, cool morning, Eliza took a basket of laundry down to the stream that now ran clear and full after the mountain snows had begun to melt. As she knelt by the water's edge, scrubbing a coarse linen shirt against a smooth, flat rock, a flash of white caught her eye. It was a piece of paper, snagged on a tangle of roots near the bank, bobbing gently in the current. She recognized it instantly. It was Luke's letter, the one he had given her the day he left, the one she had tucked into her pocket and, in the chaos of the fire and their flight, had completely forgotten. It must have fallen out as she scrambled through the wilderness. Her heart gave a painful lurch. With trembling fingers, she retrieved the damp, creased paper and carefully unfolded it. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still legible, written in Luke's strong, clear hand. It wasn't long, just a few lines that managed to pierce her straight through the heart. Asterisk Eliza. Asterisk. Asterisk. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have stayed. Do not for 1 second think you have made the wrong choice. You followed the compass in your own soul, and that is the only direction that ever leads home. I will not ask you to forget me, but I will ask you not to feel sorrow for me. I saw a light in you that you didn't know you had, and for a little while, I got to stand in its warmth. That is more than most men get. All I ask is this: if you choose him, live a life big enough for the both of us. Asterisk yours. Asterisk. Asterisk Luke asterisk. The selfless generosity of his words was a quiet devastation. He had not burdened her with his pain, but had instead given her a gift, freedom from guilt. She folded the letter, her hands shaking, and knew she could not keep it. It was a relic of a path not taken, and to hold on to it felt like a betrayal of both his grace and her own decision. She knew he hadn't gone far. He had been helping them, but he kept his distance, sleeping in his own small cabin, preparing to finally move on. She had to find him. She had to give this back. She found him in the woods at the edge of the ranch's property, packing his saddlebags with a quiet, final efficiency. He was preparing to leave for good. He heard her approach and turned, his expression carefully neutral, but she saw the flicker of surprise and something deeper in his eyes. "Eliza," he said, his voice even. "I came to return this," she said, holding out the damp letter. It found its way to me this morning, down by the stream." He looked at the letter in her hand and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "Persistent, isn't it? He didn't take it. It's yours. I wrote it for you." "I can't keep it. Luke," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "It wouldn't be right." She took a step closer. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing I deserved a choice." "Everyone deserves a choice," he said, his gaze steady. He finally took the letter from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. "You made yours. You chose to honor the goodness in your own heart. There's no shame in that. Only strength." "I am so sorry for the pain I caused you," she said, the words aching in her throat. He shook his head, a decisive, final gesture. "The only pain would have been watching you live a life that wasn't true to yourself. The bond you and Sam have, it was forged in fire. Literally, it's something I could never have been a part of." He gave her a long, searching look, his eyes full of a sincere, heartbreaking kindness. "He's a good man, Eliza. He was lost, and you found him. Now, let him find you. Find." He was releasing her. He was cutting the last, invisible thread of obligation and what if that had bound them together. He was setting her free. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. "East," he said, gesturing with his head toward the rising sun. "Maybe find some land that isn't quite so thirsty. Start something of my own. A shadow of his old, playful smile returned. Find a girl who isn't quite so determined to save broken-down old ranchers.
The joke was gentle, without bitterness, and it allowed her to smile back, a watery, grateful smile. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. The final words said. There were no more apologies or explanations needed. It was a clean, though painful, farewell.
Be well, Luke, she said. You too, Eliza, he replied. He finished strapping his bedroll to his saddle, swung himself up, and looked down at her one last time. He tipped his hat in a gesture of respect and farewell. And then he turned his horse and rode away, into the vast, open country, without a single backward glance. She watched until he was just a speck, a man disappearing into his own new beginning, leaving behind the image of a choice made with grace and a smile tinged with sorrow. Eliza walked back to the ranch, but her steps were lighter. The tearing sensation in her heart, the feeling of being pulled in two directions, was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound peace. Luke had given her a final, precious gift, clarity. She was no longer a woman trapped between two men, between gratitude and desire. She was simply a woman walking home. When she arrived back at the newly built cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke hung in the air. Samuel was waiting for her, not on the porch, but standing by a rough-hewn table he had set up outside. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow over the scene. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. For 5 years, he had eaten his meals alone, a solitary figure at a silent table. For the last few months, they had eaten together, but always as a matter of function, of refueling after a day's work. This was different. This was an occasion. He had set 2 places, with 2 tin plates and 2 cups. He had prepared a meal with care, where he had once sat alone for years, a ghost in his own life. He had now set a place for her. He watched her approach, his eyes searching her face. He seemed to see the change in her, the newfound peace that had settled in her soul. He had seen Luke's horse tracks leading east. He understood. He pulled out one of the 2 simple, handmade chairs for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy that was both startling and deeply moving. The work is done for the day, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It's time to rest. She sat, and he took the seat opposite her. For a moment, they just looked at each other in the warm lantern light, the vast, dark expanse of the west stretching out around them. He was no longer the broken man she had found, and she was no longer the frightened girl he had sheltered. They were 2 survivors, scarred and weathered, who had rebuilt a life from the ashes. Eliza, he said, his voice full of a quiet, earnest gravity. He looked at her, and his gaze was steady, holding all the respect and affection he had never known how to put into words. You have lived in the shadows for too long. You have carried burdens that were not yours. You have faced down the darkness, both in the world and in me, and you were not afraid. He reached across the table and took her hand. His was rough and scarred, but his grip was warm and firm, an anchor in the twilight. If you are no longer afraid of the dark, he said softly, then I ask you to stay here, not as a debt paid, not as a hired hand, but as a free woman. Stay here, and make this your home. The seasons turned, each one a testament to their resilience. The first winter in the new cabin was harsh, a time of huddling close to the fire, of survival, but it gave way to a spring that saw green shoots pushed through the soil of the expanded garden, a vibrant, defiant green against the endless red dust. By the time the second autumn painted the sparse cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold, the Broken Horn Ranch was no longer a ruin or a construction site. It was a home, breathing with a quiet, steady life. They acquired a few head of cattle, their lowing a welcome sound in the mornings. Chickens scratched in the yard.
and the scent of baking bread once again filled the small cabin. A fragrance of simple, profound comfort. The ranch was reborn, not as it had been, but as something new, something forged in fire and built on a foundation of shared strength. The changes in Samuel were as remarkable as the regrowth of the land, with a set of proper crutches that Luke had left behind as a silent parting gift. He learned to navigate his world again. He was no longer a spectator to his own life. He took over the mending of tack and tools, his strong, calloused hands finding purpose again. He began to speak more, his voice losing its rusty edge. He would tell stories of his early days on the plains, of his wife, Mary, and his son, Thomas, not with the hollow ache of grief, but with the gentle warmth of memory. He was reclaiming his past, not as a source of pain, but as a part of the man he was. He had, as he promised, refused to close his eyes again. Eliza, in turn, blossomed in the security of her new life. The haunted, watchful look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, confident gaze. She was a partner in every sense of the word. Her opinions sought, her decisions respected. She was the heart of the ranch. Her quiet competence and unwavering spirit, the force that had willed it back into existence. It was on a trip to the nearby town for supplies that she found a new purpose. At the small, struggling church, she saw the town's pastor trying to manage 3 small children whose parents had been taken by a fever that swept through a nearby mining camp. They were silent, wide-eyed children, huddled together, exuding the same air of lost, wary survival that she remembered so well in herself. She saw her own reflection in their frightened faces. She returned to the ranch with a new resolve. That evening, she spoke to Samuel. "There are children at the church," she said. "Orphans. They have nowhere to go." Samuel looked at her, then looked around at the home they had built. He looked at the empty spaces, once filled with the ghosts of his own lost family. For a long moment, he was silent, and Eliza's heart tightened, afraid she had overstepped. Then he gave a slow nod. "A home needs the sound of children," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not hide. "Bring them home, Eliza." The arrival of 8-year-old Jacob, 6-year-old Sarah, and 4-year-old Ben changed the ranch forever. The heavy silence that had clung to the land for so long was shattered by the sound of childish laughter, of running feet, of squabbles and questions. The children were timid at first, but under Eliza's patient, gentle care and Samuel's quiet, grandfatherly affection, they began to heal. They brought a chaotic, beautiful, vibrant life back to the place, filling the rooms that had been emptied by tragedy. Eliza and Samuel found their own relationship solidifying into a quiet, unshakable partnership. There was no talk of marriage, no need for a preacher or a piece of paper to define what they were to each other. They were 2 souls who had found sanctuary in one another. They were companions, partners, and the quiet center of the new, unconventional family they had built. Their bond was deeper than passion, stronger than a vow. It was a simple, daily choice to stand together against the harshness of the world. Years passed. The children grew. The ranch thrived. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the valley, Eliza found herself walking to the low hill that overlooked the ranch. It was the same hill where Luke had shown her the stars, where he had spoken of a life of her own choosing. She stood at the crest, the evening breeze soft against her face, and looked east, toward the endless horizon that had swallowed him whole. A gentle, wistful smile touched her lips. It was a smile free of regret, free of sorrow. It was a smile of gratitude for a kind man who had shown her a path, even if it was one she could not take. She remembered him not with the ache of a lost love, but with the quiet fondness for a pivotal chapter in her story, a chapter that had led her here, to this moment of peace. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps and the rhythmic tap of crutches on the dry earth behind her. Samuel came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, comforting weight. He had grown older, the lines on his face deeper, but his eyes were clear and full of a quiet light. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and sure, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of easy, profound intimacy. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sky bleed from gold to a deep, bruised purple. The lights of their small home twinkled in the valley below, a beacon of warmth and life. "I came here to repay a debt," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying on the quiet air. "But I found a home instead." Samuel squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the small, glowing house. "And I," he answered, his voice a low, grateful murmur, "found the heart I had lost." They stood together on the hill, two figures silhouetted against the dying light, a man and a woman who had saved each other. They were silent, watching the stars begin to emerge in the vast, darkening sky. The West was still a wild and unforgiving land, but here, in this small corner of it, they had found everything that mattered. They had a place to return to. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.